An entertaining storyteller, brilliant scholar, and fierce advocate for all things just, Dr. Ruha Benjamin is a professor of African American studies at Princeton University, where she studies the social dimensions of science, medicine, and technology with a focus on the relationship between innovation and inequity, knowledge and power, race and citizenship, and health and justice. As the founding director of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab, she brings together students, educators, activists, and artists to rethink and retool data for justice. Dr. Benjamin is the author of Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code, editor of Captivating Technology, and she is currently working on her fourth book, Viral Justice: How We Grow the World We Want, born out of the twin plagues of COVID-19 and police violence. At the center of all Dr. Benjamin's work is the invitation to, quote, imagine and craft the worlds we cannot live without, just as we dismantle the ones we cannot live within, end quote. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruha Benjamin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I am beyond thrilled to be in conversation with all of you at Cuesta tonight. I am a California homegirl, and so any excuse to return even virtually is such a treat. I don't know about you all, but we're at the very tail end of the semester, and so I'm extra appreciative of people who took time to log in today and at the end of what I can imagine was a busy day and term. So let me get started with this talk on racial literacy for the 21st century by making the connection between racial literacy and this broader practice of reading reality. So what do I mean by reading reality? I'm talking about looking at the world around us, the patterns, the institutional patterns, the interpersonal dynamics, even our internal reality, like our inner monologues, and casting a critical light on what we take for granted about what we're seeing, looking beneath the surface, questioning the ideas that we've inherited, the ways that we've been socialized to understand the world, to relate to one another, even again, to understand our own place in the world, often in a way that presumes a false sense of superiority or inferiority. And so I want us to question all of that by putting on some different conceptual lenses that help us see what's around us with greater precision and accuracy. And acknowledging that it becomes even more challenging to do this when more and more of our lives are mediated by these screens that we're looking at right now. And so it's one thing to be able to read reality and to cultivate racial literacy when we're together in person in the same space, when we're interacting, we can see each other's posture, body language, eye contact. It's quite another when we're in these little boxes to be able to really grapple with a precise and accurate reading of the world. And so to begin to broach that challenge, I turned to some of the literature on online learning, specifically very recent work that's thinking about what it means to have anti-racist online learning. And I really love the title of this article, "The Future Started Yesterday and We're Already Late." So again, thinking about, what kind of future we want to create and cultivate and how we want to incorporate values of equity and inclusion and anti-racism in everything that we're doing. And one of the lines that stands out to me in this article, I hope all of you get a chance to look it up, is this line that says, enacting an anti-racist pedagogy requires students and teachers alike to bring their full selves to the online environment. And so I don't interpret that full selves to mean that we have to know everything about each other and we don't have any privacy and, we're kind of like open books. I interpret that to mean that we really put our passion and what we care about front and center. We don't pretend like we're just talking heads like pundits on TV, but we really understand what is animating our work, whether we're learning, whether we're teaching, what is at the heart of education. rather than pretending it's only about what's in our heads, what's also in our hearts. Why do we care about these topics? Why do we want to learn and teach? And so in an effort to do that, to bring my full self to this little box that you're looking at me through, I thought I would share with you just a glimpse of why I care about this topic, about racial literacy. And I'll start with the fact that in addition to being a professor, I am a mother. And so when I'm thinking about racial literacy and I'm thinking about education, I'm necessarily thinking about my children also. And so in these pictures, you see my sons, I'm sure you can guess who they are, and my nephews. And so these kids have grown up together like brothers. Me and Razi, their mom, are like sisters, even though we're not related by blood. And so the question for me is, what kind of world are we creating for these children? Not just my children, all children. And to the extent that they love each other like brothers, does the world really reflect that love back at them? How are they treated? How are they seen differently in terms of, their value, their potential? And so in bringing my full self to the table, it's also about letting you know why I care about these issues. It's about not simply an academic matter, but it's also about world building, building a world in which the love and care that these children have for each other are mirrored back and in the institutions, in the communities that they have to walk through. And so as it stands, when we think about education, when we think about our schools, there are two parallel realities at work. And here I want to think also, I'm going to get to this role of technology in producing these realities. But we have on the left the way that our schools and institutions many times are engines of inequality. That means to say that they produce more, they don't just reflect the inequalities that exist out in the world, they amplify them, they produce them, they create hierarchies and distinctions and reinforce all kinds of inequalities that already exist. And so that's one model of education. The other model that I think is much less prevalent is thinking about our schools and our classrooms as incubators of imagination, incubators of equity, incubators of inclusion, incubators of democratic participation, thinking about our schools as places where we seed the kind of world that we want to grow more of. And so in both of these parallel realities, whether engines of inequity or incubators of imagination, we want to think about the role of technology in producing one scenario or the other, one reality or the other. And in many ways, what we have now, the default setting that's being produced by Silicon Valley in terms of ed tech, that's the shorthand for educational technologies, is they tend to reproduce inequality because of not just who is designing them, but also with what values. Those values are being encoded into these digital systems, but they don't have to be. We can question them and we can design differently. To do that, I think we have to take Toni Cade Bambara's insight seriously. She's a Black feminist writer who said, not all speed is movement. I think that could be applied to so many areas of our lives. I think about it in terms of my own personal life when I'm trying to race and do things very fast and not getting very far. But I want to think about it in terms of technological speed. Not all speed is movement. And the fact that too often we conflate tech innovation with social progress. We think a shiny new gadget or device or software system or AI program, that is an indicator that we're moving forward. But in fact, technologies can just as well hide and deepen different forms of harm and inequality. And the danger is that we presume that it's neutral and objective simply because it's wrapped in a shiny exterior. So part of reading reality and gaining racial literacy is being able to peel back the surface, look beyond the shiny exterior, and think critically of what is under the hood, what's behind the screen, what are the values that are being embedded into these digital worlds that we inhabit. So we can see examples of not all speed is movement all around us, whether we look at the fact that many states now are using automated grading software when it comes to the SATs, for example. And what's happening in those cases with audits of those cases shows that a lot of times these software systems are assuming that long, convoluted sentences, big, fancy words are indicative of intelligence, indicative of a right answer. And there was one team at MIT, a team of students who actually created a program you guys can look up called Babel. And what they did was they looked critically at this grading software, and they put in, again, long, convoluted paragraphs, and they got high grades, even though those paragraphs made absolutely no sense. And so here's an example of the presumptions that are going into these grading algorithms that actually remind us that just because it's automated and seemingly efficient, that means we're going fast, the grading's happening faster, doesn't mean it's accurate or correct or fair. And so that's Exhibit A. Exhibit B. I don't know how many of you followed the story right at the beginning of COVID when in the UK, because students couldn't take their A-level exams in person, the government hired a company to predict what grades students would get. So they used all kinds of demographic data. And what happened, quite not surprisingly, is that students who went to more working class and more working class neighborhoods and schools, their predicted grades were lower than those that went to private elite schools, even though none of these students had taken the test. But because of the assumptions and the training data that was used to feed this algorithm that would spit out these predicted scores, it reproduced these class and racial inequalities that already exist. And the whole premise of this was that the government didn't want teachers to inflate students' grades. And so they thought, oh, the technology will do it better than the teachers. And in fact, what it did was piss people off. And eventually those scores were revoked. So Exhibit B of how not all speed is movement. Then, of course, we spend so much of our time on social media. And while the origins of, the internet and social media are that it connects us, it brings everyone together, it's a global village. No one knows you're a dog on the internet. That's one of the early ads put it. In fact, our social media too often is reflecting and deepening forms of harm and violence and racism and sexism, and the list goes on. And so just assuming the fact that we can be connected is a straightforward good. In fact, we can be connected to things that hate us, things that harm us. And so we have to be more deliberate about the kind of digital ecosystems that we're cultivating. And so again, this is a reminder, not all speed is movement. And then we have the environmental costs. Just because things are in the cloud doesn't mean that they're not having a really intense environmental impact. This one study that's discussed in this particular article here is looking at the carbon footprint of just training one AI model. Now, there are many hundreds of thousands of AI systems that are, proliferating, but just training one is equivalent to the emissions of 5 cars in their lifetimes. And so we should not assume that automation, that the cloud, that just because things are not in a physical form, that they're not having a really great environmental impact. We have to question that and remind ourselves that not all speed is movement. Taken together, this is what I want us to really reflect on, that there are 2 stories that are told about technologies. On the left, the story is what we might call the techno dystopian narrative, the idea that technology is going to rule over us. It's going to take all the jobs. It's going to, remove human agency. This is the story that Hollywood loves to sell us, where we think about the Terminator, the Matrix, and the list goes on. On the other side is what we might call the techno utopian story. The idea that technology is going to save us, is going to make everything more fair, more efficient, more green. If only we would hand over our important decisions to automated systems, we'd be in better hands. This is the narrative that Silicon Valley loves to sell us. And while these seem like opposing stories, right? They have different endings, one in which we're harmed, one in which we're helped, one in which we're slayed, one in which we're saved. They actually share an underlying logic. The logic is that technology is in the driver's seat, that we're impacted by these developments, but we don't have any impact on them. We don't really have a say in what's created or designed in the first place. That is to say that the humans behind the screen are missing from the scripts. Whether we're talking about the values, the desires, the ideologies, the incentives that are animating these developments, those often get written out. So all we're left with is the impacts, what's created for better or worse. And so one of the first things we have to do to slow down in terms of our thinking and our development is to look carefully at who and what is behind the screen. And as it stands now, only a small sliver of humanity, a very narrow demographic, is materializing their imaginations in our digital worlds. That is to say, we are living in someone else's imagination the more that we enter into these digital structures. And so we need to pull back the screen and think carefully about what it is we're creating. And I think we can do that when we shift gears a little bit, which is what I want to do now, and not focus solely on the new fancy technologies, AI, machine learning, all of that, which we'll get to in a bit, but look at simpler types of tools and objects, because the same principles apply. The same questions that we're asking about these more complex systems can be applied, and we can begin to read reality with greater precision all around us, see with fresh eyes. So a quick exercise, a quick story example of this. You see this bench here. It's located in Berkeley, California, which is where I went to graduate school. And then even once I moved to the East Coast, I, again, travel back every chance I get. And when I took this picture, which is located near the corner of like Shattuck Avenue and Ashby, across from my favorite flea market, I took this picture on a trip, and it was February, and I was living in Boston at the time. And I just wanted to lay down in the sun for like 20 minutes before my meetings, and realized because of the way this bench is designed, I couldn't lay down comfortably on it. And so I thought, okay, well, there's all kinds of practical reasons why someone would design these armrests at regular intervals. And I'm sure you could think of some, literally to put our elbows down. Perhaps if you're elderly, it helps you get up and down. When I was 9 months pregnant, it surely could come in handy. Perhaps it offers a little privacy. If someone's sitting on one end of the bench, you might be more likely to sit on the other because of that armrest. But my mind went to where some of you are probably thinking, which is this also deters people from sleeping on the bench, people who aren't wanted in this area. Of course, there's a few cute antique shops right in front, so I could imagine that for businesses that don't want people sleeping in their vicinity, that those armrests would be a good tool for them without having to yell or push people away. The design pushes people away. And so I thought, Ruha, you're probably being a little paranoid. You know, you got to turn off that social analysis sometime. But eventually I did a little digging, and I found that, in fact, it's a global phenomenon, this idea of hostile architecture in the way that we design public space in order to draw some people in and to push some people out. I found single occupancy benches in Helsinki. So only one person can sit there, no sleeping. I found caged benches in France. And in this town, what's interesting is the mayor put the benches out on like Christmas Eve. And within 24 hours, the people in the town rallied together and forced them to be removed, which reminds us that we don't have to just put up with what I'm calling discriminatory design. When we work together, When we organize, when we let our voices be heard, we can actually insist that our public space, our public policies, actually reflect our higher values. But my favorite example of how things are designed in a way to reinforce inequality and exclusion is the metered bench, where you actually have to put some money in for those spikes to retreat. And I think it buys you like 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. So don't get lost in your favorite Harry Potter book, because the spikes will start to come back out and probably not feel very good. What you'll be interested to know is this particular design was created by a German artist to get us to think critically about how we create things, how we design things. And he wanted us to think about the bench almost like a parable, a metaphor for how we design lots of things, how we meter social life, how things can be nominally for everyone, but because of the way we've designed them, they can have certain forms of exclusion and harm built into them. So the metering of education, the metering of healthcare, the metering of politics, the idea that you can only play if you pay. And so if we use the bench, first I should say, before we use the bench, to think with, this design has actually been adopted by cities in different parts of the world. So although it started out as art, there have been some mayors and some governors in different parts of the world that thought, oh, that's a great idea. Let's put this in our parks in order to push out so-called vagrants. And so be careful what you design, even when for you artists in the room, because people might think it's a good idea. And when you are trying to use it as a form of critique. So using it as a form of critique, thinking with the bench, my question for you all is, what spikes are we building into our schools, into our classrooms, into our pedagogy? And so when we think about the spikes, and you think about, let's say you start a new job, a lot of times we are not building the bench. We just got there. We just started a position, or we just entered a classroom. We've inherited the spiked bench. Someone hands us a way of doing things. Teach this way, do the job this way. And we didn't have any say in how that way was created, but now we're being asked to carry it forward, to continue it. So the question becomes, what is our responsibility as individuals when we inherit the spiked bench? What should we do? How should we operate? Should we just continue perpetuating a harmful practice, a harmful design? Or should we work with others like those people in France in order to change the status quo? And so coming back to racial literacy and how we read reality, looking beneath the surface, finding the spikes, because a lot of the spikes aren't obvious. They're not on the surface. They're not in our faces. They're embedded in the structure of the world that we live in. We have to be able to read reality. And too often racism distorts our ability to see clearly. It distorts not only our understanding of larger patterns, like I said earlier, it distorts our interpersonal dynamics, and it distorts how we even see ourselves. A few examples I'll give of this before in different contexts, and then I'll apply it again to online learning and technologies. How does racism distort how we see so that we can't develop racial literacy? So here's an example from a few years ago. So what you're looking at is the images that the North Miami PD, police department, was using for target practice. So they were at the shooting range, and these were the faces that they were practicing on. This is how they were practicing seeing danger and threat. So is it any wonder that if this is how they're practicing, that when they hit the streets, this is also what they associate, who they associate with danger and threat? So it really matters how we practice seeing, what we're doing behind closed doors. That's part of our socialization, part of how we naturalize seeing certain groups as a threat or danger, or certain groups as inherently innocent and good. The only reason we know about this is because the sister of one of these young men went to the shooting range because she was in the National Guard, and she saw her brother's photo in the trash can with a bullet hole through the forehead and thought, what in the world is going on? And so she went to the media and she started raising her voice about this. And what was also a development was that clergy in the area in Miami were outraged as well, along with everyone else. And they created a hashtag, use me instead. And they put their own faces there. The majority of them were white clergy in the area. And they were moved to call attention to the hypocrisy and harm of this everyday practice of anti-Blackness by law enforcement. And so they remind us that, again, we don't simply have to put up with it. We can actually work together to counter these forms of harm that we think is or don't reflect our values. And so we move from policing to preschool, a very unlikely place to see racist distortions, but many times that's where it starts. Here's a study from Yale in which the researchers put eye tracking technology on preschool teachers. And they had them look at little children playing together in these videos. And then they said, look for the challenging behavior. And the vast majority of teachers' attention invariably went to the little Black kids in the playgroup, even though they were behaving the same way as all the other kids. They were hired child actors instructed on how to behave. And so what's happening here, where we're talking about profiling in adulthood by police, but we all can see a spectrum that goes all the way down to childhood in education in a whole completely different arena, but it's connected. These distortions are connected. This way of seeing is connected, but it's not natural. And we're going to come to that in just a minute. So I don't want you to assume that, oh, human beings are just like this. No, we're taught to see the world through these distorted lenses, which means we can be taught not to see the world that way. The example I want to give you before I get to that point is out of Stanford, because when we think about how these distortions happen in our cognition, there's a good study that shows that when the researchers presented white Americans with data on the racial disparities in our jails and prisons in this country, showing the higher rate of incarceration of Black people, they had an interesting finding. That was when their survey respondents were presented with the data, they were less likely to want to support reforms that could actually challenge those disparities, that could undo them. The policy in California, the 3 strikes law, in New York, the stop and frisk policy. So the more people were presented with data on disparities, the less likely they were to want to support reforms to the policies, which seems somewhat counterintuitive if we assume that just understanding the facts or the statistics will lead to certain enlightened conclusions. So in the researchers' words, they said using statistics to inform the public about racial disparities can backfire. Worse yet, it can cause some people to be more supportive of the policies that create those inequalities. And so what's happening here between the stats and people's cognition, this intervening space? We could call it, interpretive lenses. We can call it racial narratives. We can say cultural lies, or a distorted way of seeing because of the racist understandings that they have about the world, that if there's more Black people in our jails and prisons, it must simply be because Black people are more prone to crime, despite all of the data that points to otherwise. And so it reminds us that the stories, this stuff that's happening right here, the stories that are told about the social world are just as important as the statistics if we want to be able to cultivate a different world, one that's based on equity and justice. And so we move now from those public attitudes to a quick historical detour. Again, remember I said, just because we see this pattern where we see these distortions in almost everywhere place we look, doesn't mean it's natural. They've been created over time, socialized, and science and scientists have played a part in creating those distortions. And so here you have a photo of a very renowned French naturalist, Georges Cuvier, who was one of these scientists who helped to create this architecture of race. We can imagine this architecture that we continue to live inside of. And so Cuvier wrote, "The white race with oval face, straight hair and nose, to which the civilized people of Europe belong, and which appeared to us the most beautiful of all, is also superior to others by its genius, courage, and activity," to which he, of course, compared the Negro race, marked by black complexion, crest of woolly hair, compressed cranium, flat nose, the projection of the lower parts of the face and thick lips, evidently proximate to the monkey tribe, the hordes of which it consists have always remained in the most complete state of barbarism. Presented here as objective fact, as a clear reflection of reality despite its distortions. Couple things going on. We could probably talk about it for an hour, but I'm just going to highlight a couple things before bringing us back to the present. One, take note of this juxtaposition of black and white. So if we imagine we're in this racist architecture, then these are twin pillars that help to hold up this structure. To understand the supposed superiority of whiteness, Cuvier and his colleagues needed to create a foil, that is the purported inferiority of blackness. The other thing to note is that he and his colleagues don't talk simply in the abstract and generalities, white civilization over here, black culture over here. They're mapping these racist judgments onto something seemingly concrete, fleshy, the body. Why is that? Because the more that they can associate these racist judgments and hierarchies onto something concrete, then the less likely we are to question them, because they come to appear as if they are natural, immutable, fixed, God-given. And the more we think of race and racism as fixed, God-given, inherent, immutable, the less likely we try to do anything about it. It seems fixed in place. And so the power of creating these natural hierarchies is that they make sure that they're passed on. They have this longer shelf life. So one of the things we could all do yesterday is to begin to denaturalize these racist associations, because they continue to live with us today in how we think about different groups, the ones that we think of as inherently intelligent or inherently athletic or inherently, good, inherent leaders, some that are creative, some that are prone to crime, some that are good. And so all of these judgments continue to be passed down generation to generation and are mapped onto the body in the way that we see each other. The last thing I want to point out before moving on is that a lot of times when we hear these examples from the past, we kind of feel protective, like, oh, we can't impose our values on these guys. It's projecting our present day norms and sensibilities onto the past. But that ignores the fact that there were people living in Cuvier's own time who were questioning these norms and ideas, including Cuvier's own student, one Frederick Tiedman, who initially, sat at the feet of his teacher, was soaking it all in, thought Cuvier was brilliant, and ultimately began to realize, oh no, there's something wrong here. Not only is this a bigoted way of thinking, but the science behind it is really faulty. And eventually Tiedman began to publish refutations going against Cuvier's racial science. And so it reminds us that even his contemporaries, although Cuvier was renowned, getting all the major positions and money, et cetera, that there were still people who were rejecting it during his time. And so just like those clergy use me instead, there are people like Tiedman who didn't just go with the flow, who didn't just accept the racist status quo, but actually questioned and worked against it, creating an anti-racist science. Which brings us back to the present. Again, we're looking at how racial literacy, the challenge of racial literacy is being able to read reality with greater precision, connect the dots, understand that what's happening in policing is related to what's happening in preschool, understanding that the history of science that I just summarized relates to something like the Vogue cover here. And so you might not necessarily think about those as connected, but look at how the first time a Black man is on the cover of Vogue, he's represented. So they deliberately used this World War I propaganda poster, in which, in that case, the mad brute was the German. Here you have, LeBron as the black brute, his position, his growl, his posture, all the way down to his sneaker choice. And note that he's not on the cover alone. Remember those twin pillars in this racist architecture. In order to accentuate the brutishness of Blackness, you need a foil, you need that other pillar. And so you have Giselle there accentuating all of the goodness and lightness of white femininity. And so it's a gendered racism at work. And so, this is part of the landscape that we're all immersed in, that naturalizes and distorts how we see. This is a magazine cover, but if we just go to the cartoons that we grow up on, the movies that we watch, and the way that darkness is associated with evil and blondness and lightness is associated with goodness, that's socializing children at a very young age to see the world through these distorting lenses. So racial literacy in the 21st century means recognizing these distortions, questioning them, and trying to create a world and representations and relationships that are not predicated on these racist judgments, which again requires deliberate acknowledgement of them. Color blindness is not the antidote to these racist distortions. We have to actually see them before we can change them, which brings us to technology, which doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not in a bubble. It's not immune or somehow more neutral. It reflects and reproduces many of the dynamics I've described. Quick exercise: if you go to Google Images and you type in the phrase unprofessional hairstyles, you'll see images like the ones on your left. Professional hairstyles on your right. And you see a pattern emerge in which Black women's natural hair is coded, literally coded unprofessional, a la uncivilized, going back to Cuvier. With some exceptions, of course, you have the Hunger Games lady on your left, you have Beyonce on the right, but the larger rule holds. And what's interesting is that this pattern actually reflects widespread social judgments that impact people every day in schools and in workplaces around hair-based discrimination. It's so widespread, in fact, that there are laws being passed to address it. One, I believe, just passed in the House called the Crown Act. And so our technology is holding up a mirror to things that we might not otherwise notice or take seriously. So that example might be easy to write off in terms of technology and its impacts. But what about even more consequential ways in which technology might impact us? We know from mounds and mounds of social science research that there are numerous biases and forms of discrimination that infect our healthcare system, from the way that medical students treat and see Black patients, assuming often that they are not feeling the same amount of pain as white patients when they're looking at a very similar X-ray, to the way that all the way up the hierarchy, even medical residents are treated by their colleagues and other staff, and the way that nurses sort of make judgments about patients. The list goes on. And so, presented with this research, some people might assume, oh, well, if humans are so biased, why don't we let technology make these decisions about patient care? Wouldn't we be in better hands? Remember those two stories that we think about technology. Well, again, what if we outsource decisions to AI? What would happen if we brought in these automated systems in terms of our healthcare system? And so that is a question that's animated two of the books that I've written recently. And one here, Race After Technology, is looking more at the context of policing, and where I talk about the new Jim Code. And then this edited volume is looking at this context from many different angles, bringing together researchers who work on different aspects of the problem to think through the connections that are being drawn around the carceral technoscience. The reason why I started working on those books is because I was noticing headlines and hot takes like these about racist and sexist robots. There was a first wave of stories a few years ago that seemed to be surprised. Oh my gosh, technology is not neutral. And then we've entered a second phase in which the reporters seemed less surprised. Of course, technology inherits its creators' biases. Now I think we've entered a phase of many different attempts to address the default settings of racist and sexist robots. And here, robots is a kind of shorthand to think about automation and advanced technologies more broadly. And so one of the challenges we face is how to meaningfully differentiate these tools that are meant to differentiate us. So the connecting strand between this work is what I've dubbed the new Jim Code, innovation that enables social containment, while appearing fairer than discriminatory practices of a previous era. So whereas in my grandma's generation, during the Jim Crow era, she might have walked up to a hospital and seen a big whites only sign there, letting her know she didn't belong. But now I can walk through the front door, but there may very well be a healthcare algorithm making decisions about my care that creates the same pattern of discrimination and resource allocation, but without me even knowing it. So that's part of the danger of the new Jim Code, is that it can reinforce racial discrimination, but it's hidden behind a veneer of technological neutrality. And so to help us make sense of these different aspects of the new Jim Code, I've described 4 different dimensions that fall along a kind of spectrum, from the more obvious types that we can usually see coming that are harmful, engineered inequity, to the more insidious types that seem like they're doing good, but if you look a little closer, look a little deeper, you can see how they might be perpetuating forms of harm. And so I'm not going to get into these now for the sake of time. I'm just going to highlight that third one because it relates back to our schools, our classrooms, and to online learning more broadly. And so coded exposure names this tension between being invisible, like this photo shows, in which a lot of facial recognition systems can't pick up people with darker skin accurately. And it's that side alongside the over surveillance, the hyper visibility, when these systems to continue to target communities and populations based on a presumption of guilt and threat. And so looking at being invisible and hypervisible at the same time is an important rubric to think through the range of harms that can come when, again, we're going to talk about it in the context of technology and education. Let me just look at the time. I would usually show a quick video. Yeah, I'll show you guys this 2-minute video, and then I'm going to start moving towards conclusion. So this video is going to reflect one side of that, previous slide that you'll know what it is.
Hello? Motion sensors. Motioning. Motioning. Please sense me.
Oh, one other thing. Lem mentioned that there's something weird going on with the motion sensors in the lab.
Oh, yeah. We replaced all the sensors in the building with a new state-of-the-art system that's going to save money. It works by detecting light reflected off the skin.
Well, Lem says it doesn't work at all.
Lem's wrong. It does work. Although there is a problem. It doesn't seem to see black people.
The system doesn't see black people?
I know. Weird, huh?
That's more than weird, Veronica. That's basically, well, racist.
The company's position is that it's actually the opposite of racist because it's not targeting black people, it's just ignoring them. They insist the worst people can call it is indifferent.
Nothing. We never should have let that white guy off.
We're 8 black men in an elevator. Of course the white guy's gonna get off. Veronica? Oh, God, this looks way too aggressive.
No, it's okay. I think I know why you're all here. Well, most of you.
I have something prepared. Veronica, you are a terrific boss.
Thank you, Lem. I'll take it from here. Let me start by apologizing on behalf of Viridian for this inexcusable situation.
I laid into Veronica pretty good.
I figured it was my only shot, so I took the gloves off.
Wow, that sounds great, Lem. Sounds like you gave the company a really strong message.
Oh, yeah. She said they're working 24/7 to make things right. Can you believe this?
I know, isn't it great? We all get our own free white guys.
You like it?
Yeah. Hey, Ty's the best. He anticipates everything I need. Plus, he picked up my dry cleaning. Oh, and he got this kink out of my neck.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
My white guy sucks.
Well, maybe you're just not using yours right.
Yeah, maybe it's on you, dude.
Shut up, Stu.
I got the worst black guy.
It turned out Lem had also been thinking about the money issue, and he put together some interesting numbers to show us. And then, we all went to speak to management in a language they could understand, within a margin of error of plus or minus 1%. And so, if the company keeps hiring white people to follow black people, to follow white people, to follow black people by
Thursday, June 27th, 2013.
every person on Earth will be working for us. And we don't have the parking for that.
All right. I'm not sure how many of you recognize that scene. It's from the show Better Off Ted, which is now off the air. And that episode is called Racial Sensitivity, in case you want to watch the whole thing online. And what it really depicts is how a superficial diversity ethos, the prioritization of efficiency over equity, and the default whiteness of tech development all work together to ensure that innovation literally produces containment. The fact that darker skinned employees are unable to use the elevators, open doors, water fountains, all treated as a minor inconvenience in service to a greater good. But good for whom is what we have to continuously ask. And the real genius of the clip, I think, is bringing back this iconic image of the water fountain, which is from a prior era of racial domination, to show how it can become a fix to deal with what I'm calling the new Jim Code, the discrimination of these particular censors. And so if we think about this context, this dialectic relationship between being invisible and hypervisible in the context of schools and online classes, we can point to a recent study called Biases in Online Classes that measured professors, instructors' responses to students' discussion comments. And the researchers found that from 124 online courses, instructors were 94% more likely to respond to comments that were presumed to be from white male students. And so what the researchers did was change the names on the comments, and that the names were racialized and gendered. And then they waited to see who instructors would respond to, as to kind of suss out, who was being prioritized in this online environment. And of course, this, like so many other aspects of tech-mediated discrimination, doesn't require anyone to be self-conscious or intentional about the harm. In fact, it really relies on an indifference to the social context and not thinking rather than necessarily being malicious. And so a lot of times people will ask, well, do you think they were trying to be discriminatory? And I think that's question in some ways is not relevant. It's about the impact of the actions more so than the intent behind them. So that's being invisible. Well, what about being hyper visible, being seen when you don't want to be seen? And I think this can really be applied to the many kinds of proctoring software that have been adopted, even more so in our COVID times, but already existed before that. And so in addition to the fact that a lot of this software relies on facial recognition that is very faulty, like the clip showed, the fact that students have been documented, they've been trying to use various, proctoring software, and they're prompted to shine a brighter light on their faces if they're darker skin, so that the technology can pick pick them up more accurately. So that's an example of being forcing to be hyper visible. But it even goes, in addition to the racial dimensions of it, it really distorts in many ways the learning environment. As this one student put it, it's not just about racial bias. There's the unaccountable data collection and the damage to the student-teacher relationship, he says. And so many of these companies that are selling ed tech to our schools are taking student data and buying and selling it for a variety of reasons. And it's that aspect of what's happening behind the screen that we also have to be able to see and understand in order to stop. A teacher at the University of Delaware, Jennifer Buckley, put it like this: "No, thank you. I'd rather my students not feel like they're in a police state." And so again, this idea of invisibility and hypervisibility forces us to think about what authentic assessment looks like in our colleges, investing in people, not proctoring, thinking about what the underlying nature of the values and relationships are that structure our classes. It entails listening to students. A few years ago, students in Brooklyn protested their high school's adoption of an online program that was developed by Facebook. And one of the problems that they had with it is that they were sitting in front of screens every single day and had 10 to 15 minutes of mentoring time with their teacher every week. And so they decided this is not really learning, and we're being, babysat by these devices, and we refuse. And so they protested and had that learning program, online program, removed. Similarly, in a town in Kansas, and where the school board again adopted one of these programs, Summit Learning again, parents, students, they were all frustrated because it was amplifying not only, issues that had to do with, a little bit of time with instructors, but any kids with disabilities, they were being aggravated. The time staring at a screen were producing seizures and all kinds of other physical and mental health issues. And so again, the entire town protested against this. And so it's about listening to people's actual concerns and needs when it comes to our adoption of technology, developing what some researchers have called pedagogies of educational dignity, which involves recognizing, and this is a screenshot from my lab here, the Just Data lab, recognizing the power of students to read the world, make meaning, and act with intention and efficacy. So that's one way of understanding what pedagogies of educational dignity is. In theory, the question becomes, what is it in practice? What does it look like to read the world, make meaning, and act with intention, whether in our online classes or in our in-person classes? One answer to that can be found in this great volume, which actually you can download for free, called Critical Digital Pedagogy. It's a collection of essays that lays out many of the concerns when it comes to technology and education and solutions, ways to address it. One of the authors, Pete Rohrbar, says digital tools offer the opportunity to refocus how power works in the classroom in its evolution from passive consumption to critical production, from the cult of the expert to a culture of collaboration. The critical and digital classroom emerges as a site of intellectual and moral agency. And similarly, another one of my colleagues, Mahabali, writes in the same volume, which maybe someone can drop the link for this book in the chat. Critical pedagogy for her is not about knowing how to do everything right or getting it right the first time or every time. It's about putting faith in our learners to take control of their learning and teach us, each other, and themselves in the process. And so it's trial and error, it's experimenting, it requires humility, and it requires questioning the tools that we've been handed. Finally, a wonderful resource, similar, you can download for free, and someone else can drop this link in the chat, called the Advancing Racial Literacy in Tech Handbook. And it applies to tech in every area of our lives, definitely to tech in education. And the point of this particular handbook is threefold. to develop an intellectual understanding of how structural racism operates in algorithms, social media platforms, and technologies not yet developed, and emotional intelligence concerning how to resolve racially stressful situations, and a commitment to take action to reduce harms to communities of color. And so as a final proposition, I want to suggest this. If inequity is woven into the very fabric of our society, that means we see it from policing to preschool to public attitudes to pop culture, then each twist, coil, and code is a chance for us to weave new patterns, practices, and politics. The vastness of the problems that we're up against will be their undoing once we accept that we are pattern makers, that we don't simply have to inherit and continue the old patterns that we've been handed, but we can actually develop new patterns of relating, thinking, and working together. And so what does that look like in practice? I think it looks like focusing on the everyday nuts and bolts of what we do, our workplaces, our classes, rather than big grand events and statements that are flashy. It's questioning how we've always done things and looking to see changes in the nitty gritty. It's expanding what we teach, not just who we teach, shifting from cosmetic to substantive inclusion, rather than just looking at things at the surface, thinking about what's hiding beneath the surface, what values are animating what we do. Last but not least, it's about prioritizing the process, how we do things, not just the endpoint, not just trying to race to some desired ideal endpoint so we can make a big show of that. It's about who we're listening to and engaging. And in that, I return to Tony Cade's incisive point. When we think about process, not endpoint, not all speed is movement. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Benjamin. That's wonderful. I like the line, what spikes are we building into our education? I thought that was really cool. We're going to move to Q&A now, and it's going to be facilitated by Darius Jones. Darius is a political science major and first-year student at Cuesta College. At Cuesta, Darius serves as the vice president of the Associated Students at Cuesta College and the vice president of the Black Student Union. I hear he might be a president-elect next year. Darius is excited to continue working with students and staff to improve student life on campus. And let me see if I can co-pin him here, and so he could start the Q&A. There we go.
Awesome. All right, sweet. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin, for your time and really sharing this informative presentation on racial literacy in the 21st century. Similar to Karina Love, one of the main things that really resonated with me was that driving question that you prompted of what spikes are we building? And so I'm really excited for your thoughts as we transition into this Q&A aspect. And so the first question that we have is, can you tell us about what inspired you to pursue your field of research?
Yeah, there's so many different origin points I could point to. So let me see what would be most pertinent. I think when I was about 15 years old, there was an experience that I had moving with my family from South Carolina to the South Pacific. We moved to the Marshall Islands, and at that time, I wasn't in school. I was like finished one school and I was waiting to start another school. And so I had like a 7-month gap to just take it all in. And one of the experiences I had was going from our capital island, Majuro, to a neighboring island that was a military base at the time, Kwajalein. And Kwajalein was a US military base. And right next door to Kwajalein was an island called Ibai. And Ibai was what some people call the ghetto of the Pacific. It was really run down. There were hardly any palm trees. People lived in like shanty-like conditions. The rate of infectious diseases was really high because of the living conditions. And so on one particular weekend, I got to experience both Kwajalein and Ibai. Kwajalein was the military base, and it was like being in suburbia. It was like someone flew me and dropped me in like the Stepford Wives movie. Green lawns everywhere, golf courses, Baskin Robbins, people walking around with little strollers. Like you would not know you're in the Pacific, much less right next door to this really deteriorated island. And what was another dimension of it that I learned was that Marshallese, who had been affected decades prior by the testing of bombs by the US, their health had deteriorated, their children were born disabled. And so they were given checks every month from the US, and some of them came to Kwajalein to work, but had to go back to Ibai. So it was this juxtaposition when I was 15 years old, noticing how this two parallel universes were created, right side by side, these two islands, and they were created through policies of my country, and they impacted people who had no say in these policies, and yet they were creating premature death for some and health and longevity and a good life for others. And so at a really formative age, it was seeing this, what we might just call engineered inequity, that really stuck with me. And it lit a fire in me to understand and look for how this is happening in other areas. So if you remember the talk, how I started by showing those two side-by-side photos of the kids, one with kind of getting downloaded and one whose imagination was being sparked. That's another example of like parallel realities of how so often, for some people to be uber wealthy, some people have to be immiserated. Like the relationship between wealth and power, and thinking about issues of justice from that early age, I think is something that has been really formative in my work, whether I'm thinking about it as in terms of health or technology or science.
Oh, thank you so much for answering that. Thank you. Awesome. And so the next question that we have is, how can students and staff work together in order to create an anti-racist school system?
Yeah, that's a good one. And I feel like in some ways, some of the threads that I wove together in the talk could be applied to that question in terms of starting with listening to people and their concerns, and having an infrastructure where those can be surfaced, so that people aren't just encountering these institutions in a top-down way where all the decisions are made without their input. So it's about democratizing and creating participatory mechanisms where our varied experiences can be heard, and then the next step is taken seriously. Because sometimes people will voice the ways that a policy or a practice is harmful or excluding them or diminishing them, and we will give them air, but they won't be taken seriously. The next step won't be to actually try to redress it. And so I think we have to create mechanisms to make that democratization, make it routine. It can't rely on the goodwill, simply the goodwill of people. Like we hope people will be, who will listen, or we hope, teachers or staff and officials will be good and thoughtful and inclusive. We actually have to create the mechanisms for that to happen, regardless of people's intent, regardless of people's well-being. And so taking a look again at the everyday workings of our classes and our schools, and asking of each thing, like, is this reinforcing forms of exclusion, racism, discrimination, or is this working against it? Is it creating more equity and more inclusion? And putting all of those things under the microscope and being willing to change the things that we find are not supporting that vision.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I love that question that you prompted of, are we reinforcing or working against it? Absolutely. And thank you for also including listening as like a key aspect as well. And I know even within our school, it's really important for us to kind of have mutual language and understanding of what these terms are. And so I'm curious if you have a good definition as to what listening is. And also, a student also asked if you knew like a definition for equity, and if you see if there's like some sort of relationship between those two terms.
Yeah, that's a good question. I will say that I'm not a really good person for definitions. Like I don't ask my students to memorize definitions, and I usually don't have them handy, in part because I'm really keen on looking at how things are practiced. I think sometimes a definition, it feels very static to me, and then that's used in order to judge, is this equity according to this definition, or is this listening, as opposed to actually, what does it feel like? What does equity feel like? What does listening look like? And so it's thinking about what these different terms mean in practice. So in practice, one of the things that really comes to mind in terms of listening, I would really encourage people to look it up, is this elementary school in the UK in which the kids are taught and practice how to listen to each other as part of all of their classrooms. And there's this documentary video showing how like kids that look like they're like 8 or 9, sitting across from each other in little pods, one-on-one, and they're learning how to listen. They're learning how to ask each other questions to elicit different points of view. And the maturity and sophistication in which these little people are listening to each other, you probably couldn't find in like the parliament and in most governments around the world in terms of like politicians. So one, it reminds us that listening can be taught, but it requires practice. It's something that they're doing as a matter of like everyday practice. And in part, what it relies on is asking good questions. And so, it's really quite remarkable how, I can want to share something with you, but if there's not a question that elicits it, then I might never find a way to express it. So there's this reciprocity that's required in terms of listening and asking good questions that draw out people's vulnerability, people's willingness to share, and also to hold space for complexity and contradiction. And so in practice, this school in the UK, which is like a very diverse school, kids, from many different backgrounds with their little cute English accents, listening and talking to each other, is to me like, my dream is to one day visit, and also for that model of education to be transported everywhere, including to the highest halls of government, where most adults don't know how to listen and ask questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Absolutely. I got another question in the chat. And so it says, as you mentioned, that data can reinforce inequities. As an institution that glorifies data in the development of new practices, do you have suggestions on what we should use in addition to data when making decisions?
Yeah. So first is to recognize that data are stories. So there are stories embedded in the data, starting with what question was asked to produce that data. Why do we have data on some things but not others? Because someone thought it was good to collect that data because there was a question or a problem that they posed to elicit that data. So these two questions relate because data is the outcome of asking certain kinds of questions. And so part of the first step in really thinking critically about data and technology is to denaturalize it, not to assume that data is like fruit on a tree that just grows naturally, that you go and pluck. When we talk about research, even like undergrad research, we say, I found this data as if it was just out there in the world, when I think we should say we produced this data. And so the question is, why did we produce this data? For what ends? And what data aren't we producing? And at the institutional level, that becomes really important. Because in fact, many of the ed tech solutions that are being sold to our colleges and universities are often predicated on making students the problem rather than the institution. So for example, there are these student success predictor tools that essentially are used by college staff and advisors in order to decide which students are at risk or not, at risk of dropping out. And so you might be with an advisor and then they pull up a profile and then there's high risk. Darius, you're high risk. Maybe someone else is low risk in terms of dropping out, and then the interaction flows accordingly. So it's interesting to me that the students are labeled with these risk categories, but the institutions or the disciplines or the departments are not. So my question is always, what is producing that risk for students? What kinds of institutional practices and policies are making it so that some students drop out or not? Whether we're talking about financial aid, whether we're talking about hostile climates. And so I think the first step for everyone is to ask, who does this data serve? Who is this technology? Whose interest is this technology working on behalf? And often it's on behalf of the most powerful in any context that get to define and commission these tools. And so let's ask, how can we change this scenario so that the data and the technology, it represents the concerns and the interests of those who are the least powerful in any institution or any context? What would we have to change in order for that to be the case? So to understand that data is a reflection of power and it's not neutral, and that we can design technologies and produce data that actually reveal inequalities and help us create social change rather than maintain the status quo.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. So I think with the time that we have, we'll ask one more question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And this one's also from our Q&A chat box. And so it says that you spoke about creating a collaborative classroom rather than an instructor as just the one expert. And so do you find as a professor that you have to guide students early on throughout the semester so that they are better capable of meaningful collaboration? And do you have any examples, or what are your thoughts on this?
Totally. Because I don't think, like, it's kind of thing where if you've gone to school for 12 plus years and you've had one model of education, you can't just switch switch where the professor's like, we're going to be more collaborative. And then you automatically know how to do that. It totally has to be, we have to learn how to do that. And so one of the things that I do, the first few weeks of a class is kind of model what I want the class to be like in terms of the nature of the discussion, how to facilitate, how to ask questions, how to bring in examples, how to make sure the quiet people have a chance to speak if they want to make sure the talkative people are aware of how much space they're taking up, and all of those dynamics, and model that and create an infrastructure so that students can step into that and lead the discussions after like the third or fourth week, and usually in pairs. So I'll create a template, for example, of slides, and to show this is what the discussion, these are the things we need to hit, what we need to include. And then they will use that template in order to guide and sit at the front of the classroom. And I'll usually sit against, in the back or, in the wall, and let those pairs of students facilitate. This is true of my smaller seminars. It's a different story in terms of big lectures. It's a different challenge involved. But in this case, it's about modeling and showing through example. And it still doesn't necessarily always work, but it's about essentially kind of showing, not telling, what collaboration and what facilitation should look like.
Thank you. I love that. Showing, not telling. Thank you so much. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin.
My pleasure. Thank you for those wonderful questions, Darius, and to the people who asked them behind the screen. I really appreciate and love all of those questions.
Thank you so much. We'll wrap up now. And thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin.